So we're back for Module 2. Module 2 focuses on some practical examples in which investment valuation becomes a problem. And I want to do this early because many of you may think of accounting as something that's relatively esoteric or lacking practical applicability to dealing with real-world problems that we face, maybe not having much that pertains to what we see in the everyday business world, maybe not very interesting. But in fact, some of the most serious problems that we face as a world today are around investments, and specifically around investment valuation. So we can look at perhaps the two most serious threats to prosperity in the last 10 years, and they would be, of course, in the USA, the mortgage-backed security crisis, and of course, upon us right now, in Europe. We've all been reading the headlines about what's going on with Dexia, but that's just one bank, it's just one. The whole sovereign debt crisis issue. And so you're probably saying E-I-G-N, sovereign, just erase that. E-I-G-N, yeah, it's sort of a G. Well, there's no R. Okay, so let's try that again. Sovereign, yeah. Debt crisis. Crisis. I guess it's a crisis. It seems like a crisis. It's sort of a crisis in slow motion. But let's talk about what these were and how they relate to investments. So let's start with the United States. So you would think that after Enron, the Financial Accounting Standards Board in the United States would have ruled out special purpose entities, SPEs. You would think. Now, for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, you can go and look this up. But basically, there was a way to sort of create some fakey kind of entities, business entities, that they could use to hold on to certain kinds of assets and liabilities that allowed the companies to get it off their books. And lo and behold, although you would think they would not do that again, all the Financial Accounting Standards Board did is come up with a new, improved version called Qualified Special Purpose Entities. I'm not going to go into the details of what happened, but I will tell you this. Without qualified special purpose entities, the mortgage-backed security crisis in the United States could not have occurred. It could not have occurred. And somehow, accounting has managed to completely avoid any punishment. I don't know. I guess it really wasn't the accounting profession. It was the Financial Accounting Standards Board. But in any ways, it has not really come under much scrutiny for its role in that. And you just look back at the votes of the members in that, and you wonder, what the heck were they thinking? I don't know. I don't know. I'm sure they would come up with lots of, people are much smarter than I. I'm sure they would come up with lots of rationalizations and excuses about why they did it. Anyway, so here's what it did. It allowed, what did that allow them to do? So it allowed them to basically turn mortgages into little piecey parts of investments. And so basically you would create an investment, and it would be made up of a bunch of chopped up little mortgages. Because what is safer than an investment in American real estate? I mean, it's always gone up, right? It's always gone up. not always, but sort of nationally, there's not much safer. This is up to 2007. There's not much safer than investing in American residential real estate. And so people really weren't paying attention, of course, to what was going on politically with respect to, you know, the push to allow anybody to buy a house with no money down, with no income verification, basically with anything, because who cared? Because the values of them just keep going up. You didn't even have to, you didn't care, because what's the worst that could happen? You sell it to somebody else and it's worth more. So, you know, the whole issue about risk sort of got blurred here, and these banks figured out that, boy, you know what? We can turn these mortgages into investment vehicles, into little investment securities, and sell them. And it's like, it's better than government bonds. So it's great. And everybody bought into it. And banks here in Cleveland, one of the biggest banks, I mean, you know, they just wrecked themselves, but at the time they thought they were doing a great thing. I remember talking to the CFO about it at one point, and that was the future, was investing in these, was creating these things as investments, and becoming an investor in them as well. So everybody was an investor in these things. American banks, European banks, everybody was an investor in these things. Well, of course you know what happened, that in 2007 and 2008, sort of this residential real estate bubble popped. And what that meant is that suddenly people weren't willing to pay more money for houses anymore. In fact, they were paying less. And on top of that, because you had this kind of panic that resulted in bankruptcies for big corporations, like including General Motors, you know, economic activity in many ways just stopped. And so when that happens, guess what? People cannot make their mortgage payments. And so that exacerbated this downward spiral of a problem. So not only do you have the issue of people saying, wait a second, maybe this real estate is not worth what we thought it was, along with people actually not being even willing to pay their mortgages off anymore. Walking away. They're just walking away from them. So this is all sort of interrelated. It's all going on at the same time. So it's not like necessarily one thing led to another. But you probably read about Lehman Brothers and other banks as well. There was this big concern about which banks were good. And so here's the deal. These banks held lots of these investments on their, as part of their portfolio. In other words, they had lots of these mortgage-backed securities. And the deal is nobody knew what they were worth. I mean, this is the question, right? I mean, we're dealing with investments. And the question is, after you buy them, what are they worth later? Well, nobody knew. Nobody knew. I don't know how many of you have read the book Taleb's The Black Swan, but you know, human beings are inferential creatures. And so basically, we know, you know, if you see somebody walk out of the street and they get hit by a car, you think, I think I'm not going to do that. Because we learn by inference. We observe, we see something happen, and we figure out, well, if we do that again, the same thing's going to happen to us. And so this whole inferential learning process is a key thing for human beings. But the problem is that the future is not always like the past. And so even though we have a tendency to kind of overgeneralize, which is a simplification, sort of the whole issue about the black swan, the basic issue is just that the future is not necessarily the past, or it's not necessarily even an extrapolation of the past. It could be something completely different. That's something that a lot of research always seems to miss. That's it's really very odd that it never seems to pick up on that in financial and accounting research. But anyways, that's a separate issue. So, you know, as we're looking at the United States, everybody thought that real estate was always going to be worth more. And so the black swan is an old logical thing that, you know, the story is that no matter how many white swans you find, it doesn't necessarily mean there isn't a black swan out there. And for a long time it was just sort of an academic exercise in logic until, of course, they discovered Australia and actually found black swans. And so they sort of proved the inferential fallacy as well. So we're looking here in the United States. The United States has all these banks, and all these banks have investments in these mortgage-backed securities, and nobody knows what they're worth. And so, guess what? People start withdrawing their money from the banks. There are literally runs developing on the banks. Not only that, but a run is basically where people are pulling their money out. A more serious issue is that the banks won't lend to each other, which is something they do all the time, right? They won't lend to each other because they don't know if that other bank is going to be able to repay, because they don't know how exposed they are and how this whole crisis and panic and run thing is going to play out. And so you get this snowball effect where eventually the government sets up this TARP program where they're basically lending and backstopping all this lending and borrowing activity so that the banks don't go out of business. They actually decide who's going to get the money, which banks and which ones aren't. And so some ended up out of business, like the bank I mentioned to you in Cleveland, Ohio, National City Bank, ended up being acquired by another bank, PNC, because they were just the first bank on the other side of that whole funding activity. And so basically that all the National City folks were sort of SOL on that one. So that's what went on in the United States, and that of course was a huge crisis because not only were American banks exposed, but European banks were exposed as well. So the whole issue becomes, you know, how should those securities be marked? Should they be marked down? Well, of course, the banks are resisting this. The banks are resisting it. Maybe in part they're resisting it because they don't want the public to know how bad things are, but there's another reason too, because there are lots of contractual and regulatory issues related to how they're valued that affects their ability to even exist and function. So whereas we typically think of accounting as something simply related to reporting to investors and giving them the best possible and most transparent information about the economic conditions of the firm, of the bank, in fact, there are lots of other issues going on here as well. For example, and as I illustrate, or as I'm explaining here, whether the bank can even continue in existence. So for example, under most nations, there are rules related to what the capital adequacy has got to be. Certain kinds of ratios, certain dollar or euro amounts that the banks have to maintain in order to be a viable bank. Well, if they write these things down, they don't have that anymore. You probably have read in the news lots of speculation about the need of banks to generate new capital for themselves. Well, you're wondering, well, what is that about? That's about this. These banks, if they write these assets down, have got to get enough capital so they continue to exist under the regulatory regime, under the laws of their country, and they've got to go out and get new capital. They've got to issue new stock. They've got to do something. They've got to get guarantees. They've got to have, or something's got to change. So this is a big deal. So as we look at the sovereign debt crisis, now this is something, of course, that is just in the last year or so. I got to tell you, everybody knows that sooner or later, Greece is going to have to default on its sovereign debt. So the idea with Greece is it's a fairly small economy. The exposure that many banks have is not that big, but they are in the billions of dollars. So basically you've got all these banks around Europe and a few in the United States, but mostly France, Germany, and other countries have exposure to the debt that's issued by the Greek government. So the Greek government basically had to borrow money to fund the deficit that it's using to pay, you know, its civil servants, its anything that it does. So it isn't getting enough money from its taxes to pay for everything that it's spending, that the government's spending. And so it issues debt. I mean, this has been the whole Keynesian thing. See, the whole problem with Keynesian economics is, you know, the way Keynes originally saw it is that you use government spending policy and fiscal policy to sort of smooth things out. So when things get really good, you know, you can spend less, and when things are bad, you spend more. The problem is, in government, you never get to a point where everybody thinks that things are so good that it's time to cut. So it's always deficit spend. So the problem with Keynesian